Shadows of the past. The late afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, orange-tinged shadows over the quiet streets of Elmwood. On a weathered corner where the paint on the old diner sign flaked like dried leaves, a solitary figure stood hunched inside a battered phone booth. The structure was a relic of a bygone era, its scratched plastic walls holding stories untold and secrets whispered into the void. Inside, Lena Hayes, a 98-year-old woman, held the cold, hard receiver against her ear. Her frail fingers, gnarled with age and marked by years of hard labor, trembled slightly as they hovered over the keypad. She whispered into the phone, her voice barely audible over the distant hum of city traffic. "Please, pick up. I don't have much time." The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. No answer. Lena's shoulders sagged, but her resolve remained unbroken. She fished another quarter from her thin coin purse and fed it into the slot with careful precision, the metal clinking against the worn machine. Her lips moved again, silently pleading. There was a desperation in her eyes, one that spoke of urgency beyond words. Across the street, Officer Ray Calloway sat slouched in his patrol car, the leather seat creaking under his shifting weight. He was on his 3rd cup of lukewarm coffee, the bitterness clinging to his tongue like a bad memory. Elmwood wasn't known for excitement. His days were usually filled with parking tickets, noise complaints, and the occasional rowdy teenager. But tonight, something felt different. The old woman at the phone booth had been there for over half an hour. Ray had been watching her, at first out of idle curiosity, but now with a growing sense of unease. There was no apparent danger, no sign of illicit activity, yet something about her persistence tugged at his instincts. Most people gave up after a few failed attempts, but not this woman. His radio crackled to life, interrupting his thoughts. Unit 345. Status check. Ray grabbed the handset, his eyes still locked on the phone booth. 345 here. Observing a possible loitering case on Broad and Mason. Elderly woman at a phone booth. Been here a while. Copy that. 345. Keep us updated, the dispatcher replied before the line went silent again. Ray sighed, setting the radio aside. His gut told him this wasn't just another harmless old-timer wandering the streets. He opened the car door and stepped out, his boots crunching against the cracked pavement. The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain from a storm brewing in the distance. As he approached, Lena didn't notice him. Her focus was entirely on the receiver pressed against her ear, her other hand resting against the booth's grimy wall for balance. Up close, Ray could see the fine lines etched into her face, like a map of a life long lived. Her silver hair, neatly pinned back, caught the fading light and glowed faintly, a stark contrast to the dim, grimy setting. "Ma'am," Ray called out gently, not wanting to startle her. Lena turned slowly, her eyes sharp and alert despite her frail frame. "Yes, officer," she replied, her voice steady but weary. "Is everything all right here? You've been at this booth for quite a while." "I need to make this call," she said simply, turning back to the phone. "It's urgent." Ray frowned. "Maybe I can help. Who are you trying to reach?" She shook her head, a small but firm motion. "No one can help me with this. It's something I have to do myself." Her fingers hovered over the keypad again, but Ray gently placed a hand on the booth's door, stopping her. "Ma'am, I understand, but I can't have you standing here all night. It's loitering, and I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to move along." Lena's lips pressed into a thin line. She turned to face him fully, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him pause. "Young man," she said softly, "I've seen more nights than you've seen days. This call might be the last thing I ever do. Please, let me finish." Her words hung in the air, weighted with an emotion Ray couldn't quite place. He hesitated, his grip on the booth door loosening. Something about her presence, her determination, felt larger than the moment itself. But protocol was protocol. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his tone firmer now. "If you don't leave voluntarily, I'll have to take you in." Lena's gaze didn't waver. For a moment, Ray thought she might argue, but instead, she let out a soft sigh and carefully hung up the receiver. She stepped out of the booth, her movements slow and deliberate. "You'll regret this," she said quietly, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. The words sent a chill down Ray's spine, though he couldn't explain why. He shook off the feeling and reached for his handcuffs, securing them gently around her frail wrists. "I'll make sure you're comfortable at the station," he said, trying to soften the situation. Lena didn't resist as he helped her into the backseat of the patrol car. She settled in with a dignity that made Ray feel like he was the one being judged. Through the rearview mirror, he saw her gaze fixed on the phone booth, her expression unreadable. As they pulled away, the first drops of rain began to fall, splattering against the windshield. Ray couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just become part of a story much larger than he could imagine. The old woman's words echoed in his mind, her quiet warning carrying an unsettling weight. "You'll regret this." For the first time in years, Ray Calloway felt a knot of unease in his chest, a premonition of things to come. Echoes in the rain. The steady rhythm of the rain against the windshield created a surreal soundtrack as Officer Ray Calloway drove through the dimly lit streets of Elmwood. The quiet inside the patrol car was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. In the rearview mirror, Ray stole glances at the elderly woman seated behind him. Lena Hayes sat upright, her delicate hands resting on her lap, the handcuffs almost absurdly large around her frail wrists. Her face was calm, yet her eyes betrayed a depth of emotion Ray couldn't decipher. She hadn't spoken a word since her cryptic statement at the phone booth. "You'll regret this." The words played on repeat in his mind, their weight growing heavier with every passing second. What could she mean? It wasn't a threat. Her tone had been too soft, too assured. It felt more like a warning, a prophecy, even. Ray tightened his grip on the steering wheel as the station came into view, its stark fluorescent lights piercing through the rain. He felt a twinge of guilt. Arresting a 98-year-old woman for loitering wasn't exactly the highlight of his career. But rules were rules, and she'd left him no choice, or so he told himself. The patrol car came to a smooth stop in the parking lot, the rain now a full downpour, drumming relentlessly against the metal roof. Ray stepped out, unfolding his raincoat from the passenger seat before opening the back door. Lena looked up at him, her expression unchanged. "Careful, Mom," Ray said as he helped her out of the car. The cold rain immediately soaked them both, and Lena shivered slightly but said nothing. Her fragile frame seemed smaller under the weight of the storm, but her presence was still commanding. As they entered the station, the harsh fluorescent lighting contrasted sharply with the muted, rainy evening outside. The officers on duty turned their heads, curious. It wasn't every day someone brought in a woman nearing a century old. The whispers started almost immediately. "What's the story with her?" "Seriously, loitering. Must be a slow night." Ray ignored them, guiding Lena to a small holding room with a metal table and a single chair. He removed the handcuffs carefully, noticing how cold her skin felt against his fingers. "Wait here," he said, his voice softer now. She nodded but didn't respond, simply folding her hands neatly on the table as if awaiting a formal dinner. Ray stepped out of the room and closed the door, his thoughts swirling. Something about her serenity was unnerving. Most people brought in, even for minor offenses, showed some kind of reaction. Anger, fear, or at least irritation. But Lena, she acted as though she had been expecting this, as though it were all part of a plan she had carefully crafted. At his desk, Ray began typing up the paperwork, his fingers hesitant over the keyboard. Date of birth: March 15, 1926. That made her 98 years old. He couldn't help but wonder what had brought her to that phone booth tonight, what call was so important that she had risked an arrest. His curiosity gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the form in front of him. Just as he was finishing, the phone on his desk rang, its sharp tone startling him out of his thoughts. He picked it up, his voice professional. "Officer Calloway speaking." "This is Thomas Hayes," a deep, commanding voice said on the other end. "You're holding my grandmother, Lena Hayes." Ray blinked in surprise. "Yes, sir. She's—" "Listen to me carefully," Thomas interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "Release her immediately. I'll have the paperwork to your captain within the hour. I trust this won't become an issue." Ray's grip on the receiver tightened. Thomas Hayes wasn't just a lawyer. He was the lawyer. His name was synonymous with high-profile cases and courtroom victories. Even people who had never set foot in a courtroom knew of him. And now he was calling about the woman Ray had arrested for loitering in a phone booth. "Of course, sir," Ray managed to say. "I'll take care of it." "Good," Thomas said, his voice lowering slightly. "And Officer Calloway, let's make sure this doesn't happen again." The line went dead. Ray set the phone down, his thoughts racing. This wasn't just some random old woman. Lena Hayes had connections, powerful ones. He glanced toward the holding room, where she sat as still as a statue, her hands folded neatly on the table. She seemed to know exactly what had transpired. With a deep breath, Ray stood and walked to the room, unlocking the door. Lena looked up at him, her gaze steady. "Your grandson called," Ray said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "He's arranged for your release." "I thought he might," Lena replied, her voice calm and even. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, as though she were conserving energy for something important. As Ray escorted her to the front desk to complete the release process, his unease deepened. Who was this woman? Why had she been so determined to make those calls? And why did she exude such an air of quiet authority? The final forms were signed, and Lena was officially free to go. But as she stepped toward the door, she paused, turning to face Ray one last time. "Officer Calloway," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Tonight isn't over. You'll see." Before Ray could respond, she walked out into the rain, her small frame swallowed by the storm. He stood frozen, her words echoing in his mind. Back at his desk, Ray tried to shake the unease that clung to him. But as the hours passed and the rain continued to fall, he couldn't help but feel that Lena Hayes had left more than a mystery behind. She had left a storm, one that was just beginning to gather strength. It wasn't long before the station phone rang again. This time, the voice on the other end was unfamiliar, low and urgent. "This is Detective Turner," the caller said. "I need to speak with Officer Calloway. It's about Lena Hayes. Is he available?" Ray picked up the phone, his pulse quickening. "This is Calloway. What's this about?" There was a pause on the other end, heavy with tension. "Officer, you need to listen carefully. Lena Hayes isn't just anyone. She's tied to something much bigger than you realize. Whatever happened tonight at that phone booth, it wasn't random." Ray's heart raced as Detective Turner continued. "We've been watching her for months. She's been trying to contact someone dangerous. You might have just stepped into something you're not prepared for." The line went dead. Ray sat in stunned silence, the phone still pressed to his ear. His instincts had been right all along. There was more to Lena Hayes than met the eye. But what exactly had he gotten himself into? And what did she mean when she said, "Tonight isn't over"? The rain outside seemed to grow heavier, the storm echoing the turmoil now raging in Ray's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet little town had just become the epicenter of something far larger and far darker than he had ever imagined. Echoes in the rain. Ray remained motionless, the receiver still pressed to his ear, long after the line had gone silent. Detective Turner's cryptic warning echoed in his head, intertwining with Lena Hayes' calm yet chilling words. His fingers tightened around the phone as a wave of unease coursed through him. What had started as a simple loitering arrest now felt like the opening act of something far more complicated, something dangerous. The station bustled around him, oblivious to the storm brewing in his mind. Officers passed by, chatting about mundane cases or filing reports, their lives blissfully untouched by the strange encounter that now consumed Ray's thoughts. He placed the receiver back in its cradle, but his hand lingered there, reluctant to let go. His gaze drifted toward the door Lena had walked through not long ago. The rain had swallowed her fragile frame as if she had vanished into the night itself. She's been trying to contact someone. Someone dangerous. Detective Turner's words were a riddle Ray couldn't solve, but the urgency in his tone was undeniable. Pulling himself together, Ray grabbed his coat and stepped out of the station into the downpour. The rain was colder now, its icy touch soaking through his uniform almost instantly. His patrol car sat where he'd left it, water cascading down its windshield in erratic rivulets. But instead of heading to the car, Ray found himself retracing his steps toward the phone booth. It wasn't a rational decision. He knew that. Lena was gone, and the booth was likely just as he'd left it. But something compelled him to return, a nagging feeling that the answers he sought were somehow tied to that rain-slicked corner of Elmwood. The streets were nearly deserted, save for the occasional car that splashed through puddles with a muted roar. The phone booth came into view, its scratched walls and dim interior light giving it a ghostly appearance. Ray approached slowly, his boots splashing through shallow puddles, his hand instinctively resting on the butt of his service weapon. He stopped just outside the booth, peering inside. At first glance, it looked unremarkable, just an old weathered phone with a few loose coins scattered on the floor. But as he stepped closer, something caught his eye. A folded piece of paper rested on the phone's metal shelf, partially hidden beneath a quarter. Ray reached in and picked it up, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded it. The paper was damp from the humidity, the ink smudged but still legible. To the one who follows, time is running out. Find him before they do. There was no signature, no explanation, just those 3 cryptic lines. Ray's pulse quickened. Find him before they do. Who was him? And who were they? His mind raced, searching for connections that weren't there. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Whatever Lena had been doing, it was clear she wasn't acting alone. And this wasn't just the ramblings of an old woman. As Ray stepped back from the booth, his radio crackled to life. Unit 345, we've got a situation on Maple Avenue. Possible disturbance at the old Jefferson house. Respond immediately. Ray hesitated. His instincts told him to stay, to dig deeper into Lena's mysterious note. But duty called. Copy that, he said into the radio, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. He climbed into his patrol car, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the relentless rain. As he navigated the slick streets toward Maple Avenue, his mind remained fixated on the note. Who was Lena trying to contact? And why did it feel like this was only the beginning? The Jefferson house was a relic of Elmwood's past, its once grand facade now marred by years of neglect. The sprawling Victorian structure loomed in the darkness, its windows like hollow eyes staring out into the storm. Ray pulled up to the curb, his headlights cutting through the sheets of rain. Another patrol car was already there, its lights flashing red and blue against the wet pavement. Officer Dias stood on the front porch, her hand resting on her holstered weapon. She nodded as Ray approached, her expression tense. What do we have? Ray asked, his voice low. Dias glanced at the house, her unease evident. Neighbors reported strange noises. Voices, banging, something about lights flickering. Place has been abandoned for years, though. Could be squatters. Ray nodded, his hand instinctively moving to his own weapon. Let's check it out. The front door creaked loudly as they pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty halls. The air inside was damp and stale, heavy with the scent of mildew. Flashlights swept across peeling wallpaper and warped floorboards as they moved cautiously through the house. At first, it seemed like the reports were exaggerated. The house was silent except for the sound of dripping water from a leaky ceiling. But as they reached the second floor, something changed. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoed down the hallway. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably deliberate. Ray and Diaz exchanged a glance, their flashlights converging on the source of the sound. At the end of the hall stood a door, slightly ajar. The tapping grew louder as they approached, each step amplifying the tension in the air. Ray's heart pounded as he reached for the doorknob, pushing the door open with the barrel of his flashlight. The room beyond was empty, save for a small wooden table in the center. On the table lay an old rotary phone, its receiver off the hook. The rhythmic tapping was coming from the receiver, as if someone, or something, was on the other end of the line. Ray hesitated, his flashlight beam fixed on the phone. Something about the scene felt wrong, deeply wrong. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out reluctantly to pick up the receiver. "Officer Calloway," a voice whispered, so faint it was almost swallowed by the static. Ray froze. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the chill that crept up his spine. "You need to listen," the voice continued. "They're coming. Lena tried to warn you." Ray's grip tightened on the receiver. "Who's coming? What's going on?" But the line went dead, replaced by a low, droning hum that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He placed the receiver back on the cradle and turned to Diaz, who was staring at him with wide eyes. "What the hell was that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Ray admitted. His thoughts returned to Lena, to the note, to the warning. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was connected, that he was being drawn into something far beyond his understanding. As they left the room, the rhythmic tapping started again, faint and mocking. It followed them down the hall, growing fainter with each step, but never disappearing entirely. By the time they reached the front porch, the rain had subsided to a gentle drizzle, but Ray's unease hadn't lifted. He glanced back at the house, its dark windows staring back at him like a challenge. "Something's not right," he muttered to himself. Diaz didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. Whatever they had stumbled into, it was only the beginning. And as Ray climbed back into his patrol car, the note in his pocket seemed to burn like a warning he couldn't ignore. "Time is running out. Find him before they do." The threads unravel. Ray sat in the driver's seat of his patrol car, the glow from the dashboard lights illuminating his tense face. The rain had subsided, leaving the streets slick and reflective under the dim glow of streetlights. He rubbed his temple, the events of the night spinning in his mind. The rhythmic tapping of the phone receiver, the cryptic warning from Detective Turner, and Lena Hayes' enigmatic words all wove together into a tapestry of unease he couldn't ignore. The note burned in his pocket like a physical weight. Time is running out. Find him before they do. Who was him, and why was time running out? As much as Ray wanted to dismiss the events as coincidence, his instincts told him otherwise. Elmwood wasn't the kind of town for conspiracies or mysteries. But tonight, the mundane had shifted into something unexplainable. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the damp note, smoothing it against the steering wheel as he reread the words for the 10th time. His radio crackled to life, startling him out of his thoughts. Unit 345. Status update on Maple Avenue disturbance. The dispatcher called. Ray picked up the handset. 345 here. Situation at the Jefferson house appears resolved. No individuals found, just some unusual disturbances. There was a pause on the other end. Copy that, 345. Return to base if there are no further issues. Ray hesitated, glancing at the note again. Understood, he replied, his voice uncertain. He replaced the handset and leaned back, the leather seat creaking beneath him. Something in him couldn't let go of the phone booth, the note, and most importantly, Lena Hayes. Instead of returning to the station, he made a decision. He pulled the car into gear and drove toward Elmwood's Public Records Office, a small brick building that sat dormant this late at night. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for, But if Lena's name or phone booth records could point him in a direction, he had to try. The records office smelled of old paper and mildew. Ray let himself in with the department's master key, the door creaking ominously in the stillness. The faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound as he navigated through rows of filing cabinets and shelves stuffed with binders. He made his way to a desk in the corner, switching on the small desk lamp to illuminate the area. Lena Hayes. Where to begin? Ray searched for property records, phone listings, anything that might provide a clue. After what felt like an eternity of flipping through yellowed pages and dusty files, he found something. A land record from 1952. Lena and her late husband, Charles Hayes, had once owned a modest farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The property had been sold decades ago, shortly after Charles' death, but the address was still listed. He scribbled it down, his pulse quickening. This was the first tangible lead he'd found all night. Before leaving, he checked one more thing. The phone booth records. Elmwood's outdated system still logged payphone activity, a relic of a bygone era. Digging through the archives, Ray located the booth on Mason Street. The recent call logs showed repeated attempts to the same number, dialed over and over again. It was a local number. Ray jotted it down, curious about who, or what, Lena had been trying so desperately to reach. With his notepad in hand, he locked up the records office and stepped back into the cool night air. The farmhouse was a ghost of its former self, standing forlornly at the edge of a wooded area just outside of town. The drive there had been uneventful, the roads eerily empty, but as Ray parked his car and stepped out, an unsettling quiet enveloped him. There was no sound of crickets, no rustling of leaves, only the faint whistle of the wind. The house itself was a two-story structure, its white paint peeling and its windows dark. The front porch sagged in places, and the roof bore evidence of years of neglect. But it wasn't entirely abandoned. Ray could see faint tire tracks in the mud leading to the front door. As he approached, his flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a faded rocking chair and a stack of old newspapers on the porch. The place felt untouched by time, yet it hummed with an intangible energy that made the hairs on Ray's neck stand on end. He knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the empty house. No response. After a moment, he tried the knob, and to his surprise, it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing the dimly lit interior. Dust motes floated in the air, and the smell of old wood and damp earth greeted him. "Lena?" he called out, his voice low but firm. There was no answer. Ray stepped inside, his boots leaving faint impressions in the dust-covered floor. The living room was sparse, its furniture covered in white sheets. A photograph on the mantel caught his eye, a black and white image of a young Lena Hayes, standing beside a man who must have been her husband, Charles. They looked happy, their smiles radiant, despite the weariness in their eyes. As he moved deeper into the house, he found a study filled with books and papers. One book lay open on the desk, its pages yellowed with age. It wasn't a novel or a history book. It was a journal. The handwriting was neat but hurried, the words written with a sense of urgency. Ray flipped through the pages, scanning the entries. They detailed Lena's efforts to track someone down, a man referred to only as Eli. The entries grew more frantic over time, describing cryptic warnings, strange phone calls, and mentions of a group called the Accord. Eli must be found before the Accord does. He's the key to everything. They're closing in. I can feel it. The last entry was dated 2 days ago. Tomorrow, I'll try the phone booth again. It's the only place they haven't tapped yet. Time is running out. Ray's breath caught in his throat. The phone booth wasn't random. It was deliberate. And whoever Lena was trying to reach, she believed he was in grave danger. A noise from upstairs broke his concentration. It was faint, like the creak of a floorboard, but in the silence of the house, it was unmistakable. Ray's hand instinctively went to his weapon as he moved cautiously toward the staircase. "Lena, is that you?" he called out, his voice echoing faintly. There was no response, only the creak of another floorboard. Ray ascended the stairs slowly, his flashlight sweeping across the darkened hallway. At the far end, a door stood ajar, a faint glow emanating from within. He approached, his heart pounding, and pushed the door open. The room was small, sparsely furnished, but it was clear someone had been here recently. A single desk lamp illuminated a cluttered table covered in maps, documents, and photographs. At the center of it all was a large folded map of Elmwood, with several locations circled in red. Before Ray could take a closer look, he heard a voice, low and trembling. "You shouldn't be here." Ray whirled around, his flashlight landing on a man crouched in the corner of the room. He was thin, disheveled, his clothes worn and dirty. His eyes were wide with fear, and his hand shook as he raised them defensively. "Who are you?" Ray demanded, keeping his distance. "What are you doing here?" The man didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the table, then back at Ray. "You're too late," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're already here." Before Ray could ask what he meant, the lights in the room flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Outside, the wind picked up, howling like a warning. And then, from somewhere deep within the woods, came a sound, a low, guttural growl that made Ray's blood run cold. The hunter becomes the hunted. Ray's grip on his flashlight tightened as the low, guttural growl echoed through the air, seeming to vibrate through the walls of the farmhouse. The disheveled man in the corner scrambled backward, pressing himself against the wall, his wide eyes darting toward the window as if he expected something to break through at any moment. "You hear that?" the man whispered, his voice trembling. "They're here. You led them right to us." Ray ignored the accusation for the moment, his focus shifting to the window. Beyond the thin, yellowed curtain, the darkened woods loomed, their gnarled branches swaying in the wind like skeletal fingers. He could see nothing, but the sound of the growl, it was like nothing he'd ever encountered. It wasn't an animal. It was too calculated, too deliberate, like a predator announcing its presence. The man's words sank in. "You led them right to us." "Who's coming?" Ray demanded, keeping his voice low. His other hand hovered over his service weapon. "What are you talking about?" The man shook his head frantically. "You don't get it. They'd been watching her for years. Lena's been fighting them off, but they're always waiting, always tracking. You showing up here gave them the green light. You've doomed us both." "Start making sense," Ray said sharply, his patience thinning. "Who are they? And why were you hiding in here?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting between Ray and the window. Finally, he spoke, his words tumbling out in a rush. "The Accord. They're not just a group, they're a shadow. They erase people, erase truths, erase anything that doesn't fit their agenda. Lena found something decades ago, something they didn't want the world to know. She's been running ever since. And Eli, he's the last thread." Ray's mind raced. The Accord. The name was vaguely familiar, like a faint whisper in the back of his memory. "And who's Eli?" The man opened his mouth to answer, but another sound cut through the night. A sharp, snapping noise, like a branch breaking underfoot. This time, it was closer. Much closer. Ray turned toward the window, his heart hammering in his chest. The disheveled man whimpered, curling into himself. "We have to go," the man said urgently. "They don't come to talk. They come to finish it." Ray glanced at the table, his eyes sweeping over the map and documents Lena had left behind. If he abandoned it now, any leads it held might be lost. But staying here was starting to feel like a death sentence. "Move," Ray ordered, pulling the man to his feet. "We're getting out of here." The man didn't argue, staggering to his feet and clutching at the wall for support. Ray led him out of the room, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The house groaned under the pressure of the wind, each creak and moan adding to the tension. As they descended the stairs, another growl pierced the air. This one so close it felt like it was inside the house. The disheveled man froze. "They're in." Ray drew his weapon, the cold metal a small comfort in the face of the unknown. "Stay behind me," he ordered, scanning the living room as they reached the bottom of the stairs. The room was empty, the sheets still draped over the furniture like ghosts. But the air felt charged, electric with the weight of something unseen. Then the front door slammed open, the wind tearing through the room and scattering papers from the nearby shelves. Ray's flashlight illuminated the doorway, but there was nothing there, only the swirling night and the faint outline of the woods beyond. "We're not alone," the man whispered. Ray ignored him, motioning for him to stay low. He moved toward the door, his weapon raised, his pulse pounding in his ears. He stepped onto the porch, his boots creaking against the worn wood. The rain had started again, a light drizzle that barely masked the eerie silence of the woods. His flashlight beam swept across the yard, the car, the edge of the trees, and then movement, a shadow, fleeting and silent, darting between the trees. Ray froze, his breath catching in his throat. He wasn't imagining it. Something, or someone, was out there. "Back inside," he hissed, turning to usher the man back into the house. But before they could move, a sound stopped them in their tracks, a deep, resonant voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Lena thought she could run forever," it said, smooth and cold. "But you've led us to her sanctuary. You've done well, Officer Calloway." Ray's blood ran cold. Whoever, or whatever, was speaking knew his name. His mind raced. How? Why? And what did they want with Lena? "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. The voice chuckled, low and menacing. "Oh, officer, this isn't about us showing ourselves. This is about what happens when you don't listen." Before Ray could respond, the man beside him screamed, a raw, guttural sound of terror. Ray spun around just in time to see him lifted off the ground by something unseen, his body suspended in midair. The man's eyes bulged, his hands clawing at his throat as though something were choking him. "Let him go," Ray shouted, aiming his weapon at the spot where the man floated, but there was nothing to shoot, no target to aim at. The man's body convulsed once, twice, and then he was flung backward into the house, crashing through a window and disappearing into the darkness inside. Ray's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the porch. He turned back to the woods, his flashlight beam trembling as he scanned the trees. And then he saw it. A figure stepped out from the shadows, tall and cloaked in black. Its face was obscured, but its presence was overwhelming, radiating a palpable sense of dread. Ray raised his weapon, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Stay back," he commanded, his voice breaking slightly. The figure didn't respond. It raised a hand, long, thin fingers that seemed to stretch unnaturally, and pointed at Ray. "You've meddled in things you don't understand," the voice said, now coming directly from the figure. "But don't worry, you'll serve a purpose." The figure moved with impossible speed, closing the distance between them in an instant. Ray fired, the gunshots echoing through the night, but the bullets seemed to pass right through, as though the figure weren't entirely there. A searing pain shot through Ray's chest, and he staggered backward, gasping for air. The flashlight slipped from his grip, clattering to the ground and casting erratic beams of light across the porch. The last thing he saw before collapsing was the figure standing over him, its faceless head tilting slightly as though studying him. "Time is running out," it said, echoing the words from Lena's note. "But you won't stop us." Darkness swallowed Ray whole as the rain began to fall harder, the storm consuming the farmhouse and everything within it. The hunter becomes the hunted. Ray's world was a haze of pain and confusion as he fought to stay conscious. His chest burned where the figure had touched him, and his breathing came in shallow, ragged gasps. The storm raged around him, the wind howling as though the elements themselves had been unleashed against the night. The figure loomed over him, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the porch, and Ray could feel its cold presence seeping into his very bones. He struggled to lift his weapon again, but his arms felt like lead, useless against the force that had brought him to his knees. The figure crouched beside him, its movements unnaturally fluid, almost serpentine. For the first time, Ray caught a glimpse of its face, or rather, the absence of one. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, reflective darkness, as if it were a living void. "You've stumbled into a game far older than your little town, Officer Calloway," the figure said, its voice now a chilling whisper that seemed to bypass Ray's ears and settle directly into his mind. "But don't despair. Every pawn has its purpose." Ray forced himself to speak, though his voice was barely above a whisper. "What do you want? What does Lena have to do with this?" The figure tilted its head, as if amused by the question. "Lena is a survivor," it said. "She's held secrets for decades, truths that could unravel carefully woven lies. We've been patient, watching her from the shadows. But she made a mistake. She tried to find Eli. And now, so have you." Ray's mind raced. Eli. The name had come up repeatedly in Lena's journal, tied to warnings about the Accord and a growing sense of urgency. Whoever this Eli was, he was central to whatever was happening, and Lena had risked everything to find him. Now Ray realized he was caught in the same web. The figure stood, its attention shifting to the farmhouse. "You won't remember this," it said, almost casually, "but you will carry out what's needed." Before Ray could respond, the figure raised its hand again, and a wave of darkness swept over him. His vision blurred, his body growing heavier with each passing second. The last thing he heard was the distant echo of the figure's laughter, cold and triumphant, before everything went black. When Ray awoke, he was lying on the damp ground just outside the farmhouse. Rain pattered against his face, and the cold mud beneath him soaked through his uniform. He groaned, every muscle in his body aching as he forced himself to sit up. His flashlight lay a few feet away, its beam dim and flickering, and his weapon was still holstered at his side. For a moment, he thought it might have all been a nightmare, the figure, the growl, the disheveled man. But as he turned to look at the house, he knew better. The front door was wide open, swinging loosely in the wind, and the interior was eerily dark. He rose unsteadily to his feet, clutching at his chest, where the figure had touched him. The pain had faded, but a strange, icy sensation lingered beneath his skin, as if the encounter had left an unseen mark. "Hello," he called out, his voice hoarse. The storm had quieted, leaving an unsettling stillness in its wake. He stepped cautiously toward the house, his flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. Inside, the living room was in disarray. The sheets covering the furniture were scattered, and the table that had held Lena's maps and journals was overturned, its contents strewn across the floor. Ray's eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of the man who had been with him, or for Lena herself, but the house was empty. He knelt to pick up one of the photographs from the floor, the one of Lena and Charles. The edges were frayed, and the image was faded, but their smiles were unmistakable. The photograph felt heavier in his hands than it should, as if it carried the weight of everything that had transpired. A faint sound drew his attention, a rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. Ray's heart raced as he followed the noise, each step feeling heavier than the last. It led him to the study, where the rotary phone on the desk sat with its receiver off the hook, the tapping sound echoing through the room. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the receiver. The last time he had heard this sound, it had been at the Jefferson house, accompanied by a voice that spoke in riddles. Taking a deep breath, he lifted the receiver to his ear. "Officer Calloway," a familiar voice whispered, barely audible over the static. It was the same voice from the Jefferson house, calm yet laced with urgency. "They marked you. You need to find Eli. He's your only hope." "Who are you?" Ray demanded, his grip tightening on the receiver. "Where's Lena? What's going on?" The voice didn't answer his questions. Instead, it repeated, "Find Eli. Before they do, time is running out." The line went dead, leaving Ray alone with the oppressive silence of the house. Ray drove back to town, his mind a whirl of fragmented thoughts and unanswered questions. He didn't report to the station, knowing that his superiors wouldn't believe what had happened, or worse, they might already be compromised if the Accord had infiltrated deeper than he realized. He parked near the phone booth on Mason Street, the place where this nightmare had begun. The booth stood under the dim glow of a street lamp, its scratched walls and rain-streaked glass now carrying an almost ominous presence. Ray stepped inside, his eyes scanning the keypad and the coin slot. It looked ordinary, yet Lena had chosen it as the place to make her desperate calls. He pulled the note from his pocket, the words now etched into his mind. "Find him before they do." The local number Lena had been trying to reach was scribbled on the back. He dialed it, his heart pounding as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, someone answered. "You're late," a voice said, curt and sharp. "But you're not Lena." "No," Ray replied, his voice steady despite the fear curling in his gut. "She's missing. I'm trying to figure out what's going on." The line was silent for a moment. Then the voice spoke again, quieter now. "If she's missing, it's already started. Meet me at the Oak Ridge Cemetery, northwest corner, by the mausoleum. Midnight." Before Ray could respond, the line went dead. Ray stepped out of the phone booth, his resolve hardening. He didn't know who had answered the phone or why Lena had been trying so desperately to reach them. But one thing was clear. The only way to uncover the truth and possibly save Lena was to follow the trail she had left behind. As he got back into his car and started the engine, he glanced at the clock. It was 11:15 p.m. Oak Ridge Cemetery was 15 minutes away. The hunt was far from over. But now, Ray wasn't just a hunter. He was the hunted, and time was running out. Shadows in the graveyard. The rain had stopped by the time Ray arrived at Oak Ridge Cemetery. The night air hung heavy, thick with the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. The cemetery stretched out before him like a labyrinth of stone and shadow, its gravestones jutting from the ground like jagged teeth. The northwest corner, where the mausoleum lay, was shrouded in darkness, its faint outline barely visible under the moon's pale glow. Ray parked his car just outside the gates, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. He stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel path. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. As he walked, his hand hovered near his holstered weapon, a habit born of both training and unease. The mausoleum loomed ahead, a hulking structure of weathered stone adorned with intricate carvings. Its double doors, once grand, now bore the marks of time. Cracks running through the marble, vines creeping up their edges. A single lantern flickered near the entrance, casting long shadows that danced across the ground. Ray approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing faintly. As he neared the doors, a voice called out from the shadows, "You're late." Ray spun toward the sound, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. A man stepped into the light, his face partially obscured by the hood of his jacket. He was tall and lean, his movements precise, his eyes sharp and watchful. "I didn't know I was on a schedule," Ray replied, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. The man lowered his hood, revealing a face weathered by time and experience. His dark eyes bore into Ray's, assessing him. "You're the cop Lena dragged into this mess. Calloway, right?" Ray nodded, keeping his distance. "Who are you? And why did Lena call you?" The man hesitated, glancing around the cemetery as if expecting someone, or something, to appear. "Name's Gabriel," he said finally. "I worked with Lena a long time ago. We were part of the same operation, trying to expose the Accord." Ray frowned. The Accord. Who are they, really? And what do they want with Lena? Gabriel's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. They're not just some shadowy organization. They're an entity, a force, woven into the fabric of power. They manipulate governments, erase people, rewrite history. Lena discovered something they'd buried. A name, a place, a truth they couldn't afford to let anyone uncover. Eli is the last piece of that puzzle. Who is Eli? Ray asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Why is he so important? Gabriel stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Eli isn't just a man. He's a key. He holds information that could dismantle the Accord, expose their lies. But they've been hunting him for decades. If they find him before we do, everything Lena worked for, everything we've sacrificed, will be for nothing. Ray processed the information, his mind racing. Where is he? Do you know? Gabriel shook his head. Not yet. But Lena was close. She left breadcrumbs, clues hidden in plain sight. That's why she called me. And that's why the Accord is moving now. They know she was onto something. Ray took a deep breath, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. What do we do? Gabriel gestured toward the mausoleum. Lena left me a message before she disappeared. Said to meet here if anything happened to her. Whatever she hid, it's in there. The two men approached the mausoleum, their steps careful and deliberate. Gabriel produced a set of old keys, their metal tarnished, and inserted one into the lock. The heavy doors groaned as they swung open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the earth. The air inside was damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of mildew. Gabriel switched on a flashlight, its beam illuminating the narrow passage. The walls were lined with niches holding ancient urns and faded plaques, their inscriptions worn by time. Stay close, Gabriel said, his voice barely audible. They descended in silence, the weight of the stone above them creating a sense of oppressive stillness. At the bottom of the staircase, the passage opened into a small chamber. In the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. Gabriel approached the pedestal, brushing away the debris. A single object lay on it, an old leather-bound journal. He picked it up, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. This is Lena's handwriting, he murmured, flipping through the pages. Ray leaned over, his flashlight illuminating the text. The journal was filled with detailed notes, maps, and cryptic symbols. One page caught his attention, a hand-drawn map of Elmwood with a location circled in red. What's this? Ray asked, pointing to the map. Gabriel studied it, his brow furrowing. That's the old mill on the outskirts of town. It's been abandoned for years. Why would Lena mark it? Ray asked. Gabriel's expression darkened. Because it's where she believed Eli was hiding. Before Ray could respond, a noise echoed through the chamber, a low guttural growl that sent a chill down his spine. The two men froze, their flashlights sweeping the room. They found us, Gabriel whispered, his voice tight with fear. The growl grew louder, reverberating through the stone walls. Ray drew his weapon, his heart pounding. Gabriel backed toward the staircase, clutching the journal. We have to move, Gabriel said urgently. They won't stop until we're dead. Ray nodded, his adrenaline surging as they began to ascend the staircase. The growling followed them, accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps. Whatever was chasing them wasn't human. As they reached the top of the stairs, the doors of the mausoleum slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging them into darkness. Gabriel fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. Hurry, Ray urged, his flashlight beam darting back toward the staircase. The footsteps were closer now, echoing up the stone steps. Gabriel finally managed to unlock the doors, and the two men burst out into the night. They ran through the cemetery, their breaths ragged, the journal clutched tightly in Gabriel's hands. Behind them, the growling grew louder, the sound of their pursuer closing in. Ray turned briefly, catching a glimpse of a shadowy figure moving with unnatural speed, its form shifting and fluid like living darkness. They reached Ray's car, and he yanked the door open. Jumping into the driver's seat, Gabriel dove into the passenger side, slamming the door behind him. "Go!" Gabriel shouted. Ray didn't hesitate, the tires screeching as he accelerated down the gravel path. In the rearview mirror, he saw the shadowy figure standing at the cemetery gates, its glowing eyes fixed on them. It didn't pursue, but its presence was enough to make Ray's blood run cold. As they sped away, Gabriel clutched the journal tightly, his face pale but resolute. "We're running out of time," he said. "If Ela's at the mill, we have to get there before they do." Ray nodded, his hands gripping the wheel. The shadows of the night seemed to stretch endlessly before them, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of purpose. Whatever was happening, he wasn't just a bystander anymore. They were racing against the clock, and the stakes had never been higher. The final gambit. The old mill loomed ahead, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the faint light of the waning moon. Rusted steel beams and weathered wood jutted out at odd angles, giving it the appearance of a long-abandoned giant, standing watch over the desolate landscape. Ray slowed the car as they approached, the gravel road crunching under the tires. The eerie silence of the place was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the mill's structures swaying in the night wind. Gabriel sat in the passenger seat, flipping through Lena's journal with fevered intensity. His hands trembled, the pages rustling in the confined space of the car. "This is it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lena believed Eli is, or was, here. This place is more than a hiding spot. It's a node." Ray glanced at him, his brow furrowed. "A node? What does that mean?" Gabriel hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "It's a place where reality thins, where the Accord's influence is strongest. They use these nodes to manipulate events, to alter things. If Eli is here, they'll stop at nothing to reach him." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Ray felt a chill crawl up his spine. He reached for his weapon, checking the chamber out of habit. "We don't have much time. Let's move." The two men stepped out of the car, their boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The mill's broken windows and gaping doors stared back at them like empty sockets, daring them to enter. Gabriel slung Lena's journal under his arm, gripping a flashlight tightly in his hand. Ray led the way, his weapon drawn, the flashlight in his other hand slicing through the darkness. The air inside the mill was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of rust and mildew. Every step they took echoed through the cavernous space, their presence amplified by the stillness. Stacks of rotting crates and rusted machinery littered the ground floor, casting jagged shadows in the flashlight beams. But there was no sign of movement, no indication that anyone, or anything, was here. "Eli," Gabriel called out, his voice reverberating through the empty space. "If you're here, we're friends. We're with Lena." The only response was the creak of a loose beam somewhere high above. "We need to search," Ray said, his tone grim. "If this place is what you say it is, we can't assume we're alone." Gabriel nodded, and the two men began to explore, splitting up to cover more ground. Ray moved toward the back of the mill, his flashlight sweeping over stacks of rusted pipes and collapsed scaffolding. The deeper he went, the colder the air became, as though the building itself were alive and exhaling icy breaths. He came across a staircase leading down into what looked like a basement. The steps were narrow and slick with moisture, the darkness below impenetrable even with the beam of his flashlight. Taking a deep breath, he descended. The basement was a maze of tunnels and storage rooms, its walls lined with old brick that dripped with condensation. The air was thick, almost suffocating. Ray moved cautiously, his every step measured, the silence pressing against him like a physical weight. And then he heard it, a faint sound, like the whisper of fabric against stone. He froze, his flashlight darting toward the source of the noise. For a moment, there was nothing, and then a figure stepped into the light. It was a man, thin and pale, his clothes tattered and his eyes sunken but sharp. He raised a hand to shield his face from the glare of the flashlight. "Who are you?" Ray demanded, his weapon trained on the stranger. The man blinked, his voice weak but steady. "Eli," he said simply. "And you're too late." Ray's heart raced as he lowered his weapon slightly. "Lena sent us. We're here to help." Eli shook his head, a bitter smile playing on his lips. "Help? There's no helping me. They're already here." As if on cue, a deep, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls and the floor. Ray's stomach churned as the sound grew louder, a low-frequency pulse that seemed to reach into his very bones. Gabriel appeared at the top of the stairs, his face pale as he shouted down, "They found us. We need to get out of here now." Ray turned back to Eli, who remained eerily calm amidst the chaos. "Come with us," Ray urged. "We can't leave you here." Eli shook his head again. "You don't understand. I'm not their target. I'm their anchor. If I leave this place, they'll follow me everywhere. The Accord doesn't just kill, they consume. They erase." Lena knew this. That's why she kept moving. The hum grew louder, and the walls began to shake. Dust rained down from the ceiling as a strange, shifting shadow appeared at the far end of the basement. It moved like smoke, its form fluid and ever-changing. Yet its presence was suffocating. Ray's instincts screamed at him to run, but he couldn't leave Eli behind. "We're not leaving without you," he said firmly, grabbing Eli's arm. Eli resisted, his voice rising in desperation. "If you take me out of here, they'll follow you. They'll find Lena. They'll destroy everything." Gabriel's voice echoed down the stairs. "Ray, move." The shadow advanced, tendrils of darkness snaking along the floor toward them. The low hum became a deafening roar, and Ray felt the icy grip of terror tightening around his chest. With no other choice, he dragged Eli toward the stairs, his flashlight beam faltering as the darkness seemed to consume it. Gabriel reached for them, pulling them up the stairs as the shadow surged forward, its form splitting and reforming like a living nightmare. The three men burst onto the ground floor, the sound of the shadow's pursuit echoing behind them. Gabriel led the way toward the exit, Lena's journal clutched tightly in his hand. Ray glanced back, his heart sinking as the shadow filled the basement doorway, its amorphous form spilling out like ink spreading across water. "Go," Gabriel shouted, shoving the doors open and spilling them into the cool night air. They ran toward the car, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The shadow didn't follow, but its presence lingered, an oppressive weight that seemed to press against their very souls. As they reached the car, Eli pulled away, his expression a mixture of fear and determination. "You can't take me," he said, his voice shaking. "If you do, they'll never stop." Ray grabbed him by the shoulders. "If we leave you here, you'll die. Is that what you want?" Eli's eyes filled with tears. "If it keeps them from finding Lena, from finding you, then yes." Before Ray could argue, Eli turned and ran back toward the mill, disappearing into the shadows. Gabriel cursed under his breath, slamming the car door. "We have to go. Now." Ray hesitated, his instincts warring with his sense of duty. But as the mill groaned, and the shadow reappeared at its entrance, he knew they had no choice. He climbed into the car and floored the accelerator, the tires kicking up gravel as they sped away. In the rearview mirror, the mill grew smaller, its hulking frame swallowed by the night. The shadow lingered at its entrance, watching, waiting. As they drove, Gabriel opened Lena's journal, his hands trembling. "She knew this would happen," he said quietly. "She knew we might fail." Ray glanced at him, his jaw tight. "Then what now?" Gabriel turned the page, revealing a single phrase scrawled in Lena's handwriting. "The fight isn't over. It never will be." Ray tightened his grip on the wheel, the weight of those words settling over him like a shroud. The Accord was still out there, and so was Lena, somewhere, running, hiding, fighting, and now, so was he.